This is Congress for the week of March 22nd to 26th. And the book we're discussing is The Challenge of Congressional Representation by Richard Fenno. And if you have your notes in front of you, as I suggested, the nature of this book is sort of like an addendum, an updating, not so much an updating, although it's true that one of the members of Congress, Zoe Lofgren, that he covers in this book is still in Congress, actually, and we'll talk about why he chose these 5 members of Congress. But as I say on the notes, this is you can consider this book a furtherance, an updating, and an intensification of the methods and findings and framework of the analysis of homestyle. And in some ways, especially with respect to the 4 constituencies, the geographic constituency, the re-election constituency, the primary constituency, and the personal constituency, I do think that one of the things he's doing in each of these 5 very different members of Congress is seeing how these observable aspects of both the external structures that generate representation and the internal perceptions of these as reflected in the behavior. In fact, that's a nice way to see, as I was saying in our discussion of homestyle last week, the representative link, I think, that Fenno sees, which is expressed in the concept of homestyle. If you remember my definition of the personal, professional persona, which becomes the basis of a congressional career. Some of these careers are relatively short, of the members of Congress that he studies here, and nevertheless, I think that each one of them, in some ways, again, verifies the idea that Congress does, members of Congress do in fact strive to create that representational link, the elements of which, again, we'll see this reflected somewhat differently in each of these: identification, qualification for office, and an empathy, and constituency service, by the way. That again, these structure both external and are visible in behavior and reflective of states of consciousness. So what I want to do in this first module is just examine the premise of the book and make some comments about that, plus the methodological considerations, which he's somewhat reflective on in the first part. And then in the second module, we'll actually look at the specific members of Congress, and in the third module, we'll make some conclusions about the nature of the representational link that he sees, and his call to the political science profession to generate more Richard Fennos. Again, remember the basic structure of the 4 constituencies. And by the way, I think in some ways most of these 5 members of Congress, Conable, Poshard, Thurman, Greenwood, and Lofgren, this is mostly a story about the match between the geographic constituency and there are a couple of stories of reapportionment and redrawing of district lines that have, in one case, that doesn't have a profound effect on the member of Congress's tenure, but with Thurman, for instance, it probably led to her being her bid for re-election failing after a couple of terms, and so it's mostly, I think, the primary and the personal constituencies, the 2 smallest ones, the primary ones, the ones who are most ideologically like the member of Congress as reflected in primary elections. A consideration, by the way, more important, as we've seen since the description of changes in the electoral environment, that's more important in the last couple of decades. And the personal constituency, the networks of personal contacts that provide, as he points out in Home Style, a kind of a transpartisan or nonpartisan connection with the issues going on in the constituency. But most of the story of these five members is their negotiation of trying to find that re-election constituency, to build a re-election constituency out of the geographic constituency, and so you'll see in each one of them there's different amounts of, when we look at the elements of the presentation of self, identification, qualification, and empathy. Those seem to be especially strongest in Barbara Conable and Glenn Poshard. The attempt to communicate qualification seems to be strongest in Thurman, it seems to me, and Lofgren. And to some degree, Greenwood is kind of an interesting middle character. And what you see in all five of these, of course, is the predominance of constituency service as a major aspect of building the link between constituency. And let me just say again, remind you that there might be several ways of explaining, not necessarily all mutually exclusive, why, for instance, the rate of incumbency of the House has gone up in the last several decades. One possible explanation is that because constituency service is such an important part of it, and since constituency service tends not to exist on a partisan basis, that's why so many members of Congress, not just the fact that the function of the national government is now to provide more services and benefits, and that the constituency service is often a way of members of the district, the constituents in the district, articulating their relationship to the federal government through the medium of their representative. But that would be partially why the most successful bids for re-election are those members of Congress, and they all spend a good deal of portion of this. But why that might be a critical factor for the rise of incumbency, in addition to some of the media factors that we talked about in Robinson's article. And it doesn't focus so much on the various stages of the career, the expansionist, of learning and generating, although you could say that to some degree, especially with Thurman and Lofgren. There is a good deal of concentration on attempting to expand and preserve the re-election constituency, successful in one case, in Lofgren's case, and unsuccessful in Thurman's case. Again, I think one of the things to take away from this book is that framework of the constituency elements, the stages, are borne out in this book, and that it's kind of like a proof text of that methodological approach. And some methodological considerations. Remember, the orientation for studying Congress in this class, which I take from, it actually turns out not just Davidson, Olezik, Lee, and Schickler. Most observers for Congress agree with them that to understand the institution, you have to see these not just two functions, but they really create two different institutions rolled into one. And one of the things you see in these five members of Congress is how some members of Congress are more structured to creating that representative relationship. Some want to use it more as a basis for legislation, but all experience the same kinds of elements of trying to relate to their district. And the interesting, so of these two functions, the representative function and the legislative function, the interesting methodological consideration at the beginning of the book is that most political scientists have concentrated on the legislative function because it's a more observable dimension of Congress's operation. There are more available data in the form of roll call votes and more cases of measurement and observation. And also, since the institutional legislative function is primarily concentrated in Washington. A lot of resources of study and observation there, and in some ways it's easier to observe members of Congress in that environment, and to also describe the structures that mediate the legislative function that we'll turn to after the midterm. And of course, his point is that when it comes to the representative function, there's much less studying, and I think he's right about this, by the way, that generally speaking, aside from the kind of tentative beginnings of this in the 1950s, where which both Fenno, by the way, dismisses several times, both in this book and in Homestyle, that is to say, of measuring the representative link by the extent to which voting within Congress matched public opinion polls in the general constituency. But Fenno really argues that doesn't get to the heart of the representational link. So, as we'll see when we come to the end of the book, he definitely thinks this is a fertile field for further study. At the same time that, and we'll see when he talks about the method of doing this, you can also see why this is kind of understudied. And I think it is fair to say that political scientists like Fenno and like Arnold, whom I discussed last week but decided not to use in the course this semester, are several of the few major political scientists that actually concentrate on studying this aspect of members of Congress life. And one problem is the main method of doing that, which he discusses to the end of chapter 1, is watching and listening. And you have to see that this kind of interview technique, which kinds of is, as we've already seen when I compared Fenno to sort of like Jane Goodall, somewhat facetiously, that these are like field methods of observing sociologists and anthropologists. So you could see why this aspect of studying this aspect of congressional functioning, is not as widely dispersed throughout the political science profession, because again, first of all, you can tell from his own description of what he does, this takes a lot of effort. I mean, you have to spend a lot of time with these people. And one of the things that's clear is for instance, his ability to see and observe them in their operative environment in their districts often depends really much upon comfort and attachment and a rapport with them. And you have to say that to some degree, many scientists, social scientists, are distrustful of study methods that were, to be sure, are empirical in the sense that they're based on observable behavior. This is almost as if it's a field of social psychology rather than political science, probably in the minds of many political scientists. But and again, the scientist prefers a certain kind of methodological detachment. But you can see that much of his ability to study these people depends upon, as I mentioned earlier, the rapport that he forms with them, and which determines what? It determines the amount of time that and enthusiasm with which they share with their time and space with him, and also determines the amount of access that he is granted. And yet, his argument is why. So, what's the appeal in doing this? And I agree with him that this aspect of congressional functioning is so critical to the confidence of the American people in their institution, as we saw from our initial discussions, that this kind of study is necessary. Not so much that although I as I said with Homestyle, and we'll see at the end of this book, I think he gives a kind of a moderate thumbs up to Congress's successfully embodying this function based on seeing these, in Homestyle, 18 different members of Congress, and in this one, 5 different members of Congress. So watching and listening are the primary field techniques and study techniques by which he's able to actually flesh out how this representational link is lived with each member of Congress. And and again, you could say the empirical component of his study isn't just watching the members of Congress that he studies react with constituencies in different places and everything. One of the empirical components, which he says, by the way, he gets from the Almanac of American Politics, is, of course, the information about the basic demography and geography of the district. And again, one of the interesting things that we'll see in a couple of these individuals is exactly what effect redistricting has on the relationship of a member of Congress to his or her constituents. So this brief introduction, I just wanted to bring to your attention several aspects of methodology and the basic soundness of the core framework. I'm going to keep this relatively short, and then in the second module, again, we'll actually look at the actual individuals and the way that he does it. Of the five, of course, he has Barber Conable, and then Poshard and Thurman, and we'll see why he groups those two together, and then Greenwood and Lofgren, and why those become the basis of comparison. So, in addition to looking at some of his insights in each of those individual members of Congress, will raise, I think, some of the interesting questions that you can see, for instance, how some aspects of reform, of reapportionment and redistricting, how they have a direct bearing on the ability or lack of ability of the member of Congress to form that critical link. And then again, in the third module, I want to make a few kind of summary observations and generalizations about what we've seen in the way that Congress embodies the function of representation, and how that stands with respect to the kinds of expectations that Madison and the framers in general placed upon this institution.